don't hesitate to ask the questions. Everybody has questions about clinical trials.
You go through a year and a half of watch and wait.
Mm-hmm.
You're at December 2016. Can you describe to us what happened then that led the doctor to bring up the conversation of, hey, might want to consider starting treatment?
While I was on watch and wait, I was being seen by my local oncologist. They were doing regular blood tests and then periodic scans, CT scans. So I had the 2 CT scans locally, and then realized it was time that I needed to go back to MD Anderson to check in with them. So I made an appointment with them, and my most recent blood test from my local oncologist was quite high. I was at 125. My white blood count was 125. So I was a little worried about that, and I really sort of felt like, even though it absolutely was time for me to go back to MD Anderson, but I was sort of prompted to go because I wanted to just get the second opinion again. So this time they did the same workup. So they drew the blood again. They did another CT scan, and they did another bone marrow biopsy. And not only was my white blood count quite high, but my spleen was significantly enlarged and showed up on the CT scan, which hadn't showed up locally. And my bone marrow was significantly more affected. So we had the conversation about treatment because they were most worried about my spleen. I'll admit it, having now seen the picture, it was quite enlarged.
I wonder about sort of this, the double-edged sword here, because all this time, it's like you're being told, hold on, we're not going to treat anything. And then when you're finally told, actually, it's progressed to a point where now we should consider, how did you react to that?
As I had mentioned previously, every time I sneezed, I basically was like, oh, is this it? Is this when I need to go for treatment? So my first reaction was, oh, this is what it's like. Now it's time. We're here. But I had also told you that the option had been, when I was first diagnosed, watch and wait or chemo. So my immediate thought was, okay, so now it's time. Oh crap, I need chemo. And I was quite scared about that. It was not, I knew we needed to treat the cancer, but I also know what chemo can do to you, and I was not very happy about it. Plus, then there's like, and what about my job and all this other stuff I have to do?
What was that conversation like with your doctor at that point? It was with the MD Anderson oncologist, is that right?
He's a research specialist, and he explained what the treatment choices were, but he also explained that there was a clinical trial that he had just, so he had started it as a smaller trial, and he had just gotten approval to expand it to double the number of patients. So
do you remember, what are we talking here when we say small number of patients and double? That sounds like a lot, but.
So it was originally 50 patients, and he got approval to double it to 100.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
And so he's describing to you this clinical trial.
Right. So he was describing to me the clinical trial. Of course, I was interested because I have a research background and that's what I do. But the beauty of this clinical trial was it was testing a combination of 2 targeted therapies, or drugs that we call biologic drugs. So it's not chemotherapy or chemicals that kill basically anything that's growing. So it's kind of like carpet bombing your body, but it kills the cancer. Biologics are more targeted. They find something specific about the cancer cell and attack that. They can occasionally have some side effects, but it's not the mass toxicity that you get from chemotherapy. And this was a combination of two of them that I asked a million questions about, but data looked like was a good combination that would be effective. And then after you responded to those drugs, assuming you responded to those drugs, then they would follow with just a couple rounds of chemotherapy, because they have to offer you the standard of treatment. And that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand about cancer clinical trials, is you have to get at least whatever the standard of treatment is, and you usually get more. So it's more screening, it's more follow-up, it's an additional drug, or it's plus. It's not, there's no placebo.
Thank you for addressing that head on, because that's very commonly still one of the big misconceptions, because we hear placebo a lot tied to clinical trials and other conversations. And it's like, no, in these, it still has to be responsible. They understand they're dealing with humans and human lives. You have of this background. So you start at a different place in terms of trying to figure out, do I do a clinical trial or do I not?
Right.
If you're trying to describe to people who have no idea about clinical trials, we've already covered, there's no placebo, the way that people think that there's placebo. What other factors are important to understand in making the decision about whether to enter a clinical trial?
First of all, when you're considering a clinical trial, keep in mind what I just told you, which is, yes, it is experimental, but in the cancer world, they believe it's better than the current standard of treatment. I would ask why they think that. What are the data? You may not care about that. I did. So I asked a lot of questions about how they come up with this combination, and why do they think this is better, and what are the outcomes with just the hyper CVAD. But for a lot of other people, they just want to know why they're recommending the clinical trial, how many other people are in the clinical trial, are there people like me in the clinical trial? And I'll just take a little side note here. I was a young woman with what is most commonly an old man disease. And so he was quite excited to possibly have a woman in the trial, and then asked me to help recruit other women into the trial after I had joined. But I really wanted to know why they thought this would be better than what the current treatment was. And what he told me at the time was hyper CVAD will take the disease down, but it won't knock it out. You couldn't get, it was unheard of to get to full remission with hyper CVAD. They believed, and they had enough people in that first 50 that I mentioned reach complete remission. They really thought that they could at least get you to complete remission. They didn't know how sustainable it would be. And he was very honest with me about that. But for me, that was it, right? Like, well, if you can't get me there with this, but you might be able to get me there with that, I'm going to try it, because that's better. But you also need to be comfortable with the fact that it's research. And there are questions. The Leukemia Lymphoma Society has a great resource for learning about clinical trials, and even has like prepackaged questions you can print off and ask your doctor. The Lymphoma Research Foundation also does. Theirs is a little more specific for lymphoma, because that's what they focus on. But these are great resources, and don't hesitate to ask the questions. Everybody has questions about clinical trials. I asked so many questions that he actually took me into his office and pulled up a presentation he had just done at a scientific meeting, and basically gave it to me to answer my questions. So
Right. People care about different things, but to understand, I think, why is important. You're saying that this is going to be better. Why? Why do you think that? Can you sum up sort of some of the data that's at least proven that much? We know you're still studying it, but that's important to understand. Your oncologist had said hyper CVAD would be what you'd go to if you didn't do this clinical trial, but it doesn't knock out the lymphoma and the cancer. Did he then talk about what that looked like after hyper CVAD? Okay, well, so this is what would happen, that you would watch and wait again, and then XYZ?
Yeah, well, of course I asked. He did explain that he would start with the chemotherapy, the hyper CVAD chemotherapy, it would knock it down. We would go back to the watch and wait pattern. So he's like, at that point, it's a game of can the chemotherapy regimens keep you going long enough to, have a full life. So it was sort of this life of going through chemo, watching and waiting, going through the next treatment, watching and waiting, hoping something was sustainable, or at least sustainable enough that I could, um, make it to my 80s.
And just sort of this idea of like having to go up and down, up and down, up and down, and repeat what you'd already gone through with this watch and wait period, and then crossing your fingers for the next, chemo regimen to work. So then this clinical trial, the promise of it was it's biologics here. It may really address the disease as opposed to the chemo that you would be, undergoing. So that's why you said yes. And yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I realizing it was experimental. He could not say for sure what was going to happen in my case, but there was, enough data from these previous people who had participated in the trial to suggest that they could at least get me to complete remission. We wouldn't know how long that would last, so it might end up being a very similar cycle. But when you're starting from nothing, it feels at least like you have further to go to that next treatment than if you're starting halfway there, for lack of better terminology.